The Adventure of the Silver Moustache. Welcome to Watson's Journal. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The envelope was the third one. Edmund Ashworth noticed this the way a man notices a loose thread on an otherwise immaculate waistcoat, not with alarm, precisely, but with the particular quiet irritation of someone who knows that pulling it will only make things worse. He set it down on his dressing table, beside the cold cream and the rabbit's foot powder brush and the small brass mirror that had travelled with him from a touring production in Manchester to the Aldwych Theatre's finest dressing room, and he looked at it for a long moment without opening it. Outside, London was doing what London does best in the hours after a performance, breathing out. The distant clatter of a motor car retreating down the Strand, the soft percussion of rain beginning to find the cobblestones, the last murmur of theatre-goers pulling their coats tighter against a November evening that had not, despite everyone's optimistic wishes, chosen to be mild. Inside, the dressing room smelled of greasepaint and cold tea and the faintest ghost of the stage manager's pipe tobacco, which had a way of seeping under every door in the building, regardless of where Mr. Briggs actually chose to smoke it. Ashworth had been Edmund Ashworth, celebrated actor of stage and occasional screen, for going on 26 years. He had played Hamlet at the Lyceum, Cyrano at the Haymarket, and his particular point of professional pride, the fictional detective Inspector Marlowe, in the enormously successful series of theatrical mysteries that had made his name a fixture in the London entertainment pages for the better part of a decade. He knew, better than most men alive, how to present a calm exterior over an interior that was doing something else entirely. He was, in this regard, doing it now. His face in the brass mirror was composed, considered almost professionally neutral. His hands, smoothing the envelope flat against the dressing table's surface for the third unnecessary time, were not quite steady. The first envelope had arrived 6 nights ago, slipped beneath the dressing room door sometime between the second act curtain call and the moment he returned from the stage manager's nightly debrief. He had assumed it was a note from an admirer. They arrived with some regularity, in varying degrees of legibility and emotional intensity, and had set it aside to read later. When he did read it later, it had given him a feeling not unlike missing a stair in the dark, a small, plummeting wrongness. The note had said only, "We know about the moustache. Wait for instructions. No signature. No further illumination." The handwriting was careful, almost schoolroom neat, which somehow made it worse. He had told himself it was a prank. The theatre was full of people, with what the stage manager charitably called a developed sense of mischief. Stagehands who balanced improbable objects on ledges, assistant costumers who sewed closed the pockets of actors they disliked, callboys who could mimic voices with unnerving accuracy. Someone was having a joke at his expense. He had almost believed it. The second envelope had arrived 4 nights ago, also beneath the door, also in that quiet interval between curtain call and return. This one had said, "The instructions will follow. Do not report this to anyone. You would not enjoy the alternative. Same careful handwriting. Same. For lines he hadn't yet fully committed to. For lines he hadn't yet fully committed to memory. The look of a man who knows the words are somewhere nearby and cannot, at the critical moment, locate them. It was around this time, if he was being precise about it, that he began to notice the other thing. The silver moustache had been a gift from the production's costume designer, a brilliant and rather terrifying woman named Marguerite Foss, who had constructed it for the role of Inspector Marlowe, with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, which was to say, the intensity of someone who believes that no detail is too small to be perfect, and that perfection is, in fact, merely the beginning. It was not a large piece of costume jewellery. It sat in a fitted velvet box, its bristles formed from fine wire, wrapped in silver thread and tipped with tiny crystal beads that caught the stage lighting and threw back a remarkable impression of distinguished silver hair. It was absurd and splendid in equal measure, as most theatrical things are, and Ashworth wore it in the final act of every performance, when Inspector Marlowe made his climactic deduction before a room full of suspects who had, by that point, given up any expectation of escape. He kept the box in the second drawer of his dressing table, beneath a folded cloth, because he was particular about his props, and because the alternative was leaving it in the general costume storage, where anything might happen to it, and frequently did. 8 days ago he had opened that drawer after the performance, and the box had been there, in its usual place, undisturbed. He was certain of this because he had taken it out to check the wire on one of the crystal beads, which had seemed, during the final scene, to be working slightly loose. The bead had been fine. He had replaced the box. He had gone home. 7 days ago, the box had been there again. 6 days ago, the same evening as the first envelope, he had opened the drawer, and the box had been there, but tilted. Not dramatically. Not as if thrown or shoved or moved in haste. Simply tilted, at perhaps a 20-degree angle from its usual position, as if someone had picked it up, looked at it, and set it back without paying close attention to its orientation. He had straightened it, told himself he must have replaced it carelessly the previous evening, and tried to put it from his mind. 5 days ago, the box had been tilted again. He was not, Edmund Ashworth told himself firmly, a man who believed in ghosts, inexplicable phenomena, or the kind of theatrical superstition that caused grown adults to refuse to say the name of the Scottish play aloud. He was a rational man who happened to make his living pretending to be other rational men who solved impossible crimes through the application of logic and observation. He understood in his professional soul that there was always an explanation. Things did not move themselves. Drawers did not open without hands to open them. The silver moustache did not rearrange itself in the small hours for its own private amusement, which brought him back to the third envelope. He picked it up now, deliberately, and opened it with the silver letter knife he kept beside the mirror. The paper inside was the same weight as the others, the handwriting identical in its neat, unhurried precision. He read it standing, because somehow standing felt like the correct posture for receiving bad news, more controlled, more contained. You have not followed instructions, because we have not yet given them. We give them now. The moustache must be brought to the left luggage office at Victoria Station by Thursday next, wrapped plainly, addressed to the name Hartwell. If you fail to do this, or if you speak to anyone of this matter, what we know will be known by everyone. Thursday. Do not be late. Ashworth set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment that stretched itself out into several moments, while the rain negotiated more firmly with the window glass, and somewhere in the building a door swung shut on its spring hinge, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The remarkable thing, and he recognized this even now, standing in his dressing room, in his stage shirt, with cold cream on one side of his jaw, where he had been in the middle of removing his makeup, was that he did not know what we know about the moustache meant. He had spent 6 days turning this over, examining it from every angle available, to a man who had spent his career examining puzzles from every available angle. And he still couldn't determine what, precisely, could be known about the moustache that would constitute a threat. It was a costume prop. It was silver wire and crystal beads and the careful craft of Marguerite Foss. It was ridiculous, even by the standards of theatrical accessories, and he wore it for approximately 8 minutes per performance. There was nothing to know. There was nothing to hide. He looked at his reflection. The reflection looked back, composed and professionally neutral, and said nothing helpful. He had been trying for 6 days to locate a rational explanation for all of this, the envelopes, the tilted box, the demand. He had examined and discarded several. Perhaps someone had confused him with another actor. Perhaps this was an elaborate theatrical prank that had gone further than its originators intended. Perhaps the demand was not genuinely threatening, and the alternative promised in the second note was something embarrassingly mild. Perhaps he was, in some way he could not yet identify, missing the obvious. He was still missing the obvious on the evening he reached into the second drawer, beneath the folded cloth, and found the velvet box gone entirely. This had been 2 days ago. He had stood in exactly the spot he was standing now, and the drawer had held only the folded cloth, slightly disarranged, and the faint impression in the drawer's lining where the box had rested. The moustache, the entire point of the demand, the thing they wanted, the thing they apparently knew something incriminating about, had vanished before he had even been given the chance to comply or refuse. He had searched the dressing room with the methodical patience of a man who has played many detectives, and absorbed through professional osmosis something of their habits. He had checked every drawer, shelf, corner, and surface. He had looked under the table and behind the screen and inside the coat, hanging on the hook behind the door. He had examined the window latch, which was old and slightly loose in its frame, the kind of latch that a determined person might, conceivably, work open from outside if they were willing to stand on something. The window looked onto a narrow service passage, between the theatre building and the adjacent wall. He had leaned out into the November air and looked at this passage for a long moment, and then he had closed the window and straightened his jacket and stood very still in the middle of his dressing room, thinking. Tonight, with a third envelope in his hand, and the theft now 2 days old, he had made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. He was not, he told himself, frightened, not precisely, unsettled, certainly, inconvenienced, absolutely, possessed of the growing conviction that he was caught in the middle of something he did not understand, and that the edges of this something were considerably larger than the small, absurd object at its centre. Yes, that. But not frightened. He was going to see Sherlock Holmes. This decision had taken longer to reach than it should have, and he knew why. There was the matter of how it would look. Edmund Ashworth, celebrated portrayer of fictional detectives, trotting round to Baker Street because someone had taken a theatrical prop and sent him a series of ominous notes. There was the matter of professional dignity. There was the matter of the instruction in the second envelope. Do not report this to anyone. He had weighed these concerns against each other, and against the simple fact that a man was dead. Not yet. But he had the quiet, sourceless certainty of someone who has read enough mystery plots to recognize when one was building toward that particular development, and had concluded that professional dignity was not, ultimately, worth very much if the alternative was standing in his dressing room indefinitely, reading letters and straightening boxes that were no longer there to be straightened. He folded the third envelope carefully and placed it in his breast pocket alongside the second. The first he had left at home in the small desk in his study, which he now thought had perhaps been an error in record-keeping. He looked at himself in the brass mirror one final time. At the half-removed makeup, the thoughtful expression, the slight set of the jaw that his stage director called his quiet determination look, and generally considered one of his best. And then he reached for his coat. Tomorrow morning, Baker Street. He would go early, before the day had gathered too much noise around itself, before the West End woke fully and filled its streets with the cheerful, oblivious business of people who had not received 3 threatening letters and lost a silver moustache to an unknown thief with apparently diplomatic connections. He did not yet know about the diplomatic connections. He knew only what he knew, which was that something was wrong, and that it had been wrong for the better part of a week, and that he was, despite his training in observation and his professional fluency with mystery, no closer to understanding it than he had been when the first envelope slid beneath his door. He would go to Holmes. The rain had settled into its longer rhythm now, the first sharp percussion of its arrival giving way to the steady, patient conversation it held with the window glass when it intended to stay for a while. The theatre had gone quiet around him, the last of the stagehands gone, the stage manager's pipe no longer ghosting through the ventilation, and the corridor outside his door held only the particular, attentive silence of an empty building that has spent the evening full of people, and is now remembering itself. Ashworth buttoned his coat. He turned off the dressing-room light. He walked out into the theatre, through its dim corridors, and past its stilled machinery, past the rows of costumes, hanging silent on their rails, and the props arranged on their shelves with the careful, patient order of things waiting to be needed. And somewhere in that careful order, on a shelf he passed without pausing, there was an empty space where a velvet box had once sat, and did not sit any longer. He did not notice it as he passed. He would, later, think that this was where everything had truly begun. The cab smelled of damp wool and engine oil, and the particular leather and tobacco amalgam that London's hired vehicles had been accumulating since the days when they were pulled by horses rather than petrol, as though the city itself had decided that certain smells were simply part of the contract of getting from one place to another, and no amount of mechanical progress was going to change that. Ashworth sat in the back with his hands folded over his knee, and watched November London arrange itself outside the window. It was not yet 9 o'clock. The city was doing what it does in the thin, grey hours, before the working day has properly committed to itself, half awake, going through the motions, pulling its coat on without much enthusiasm. A cart horse stood at the corner of the Aldwych with the philosophical patience of an animal that has learned, over long experience, that patience is simply what existence requires. A woman in a green wool coat walked briskly along the pavement with a basket over one arm and the expression of someone who had a great many things to accomplish before noon and intended to accomplish all of them. A newsboy stood at the mouth of a side street, calling the morning headlines in a voice that the fog softened to a kind of ambient murmur, the specific words lost, but the rhythm of them somehow reassuring. The sense that the world had news, was reporting it, was continuing in its ordinary newsy way. The fog was thorough this morning. It had arrived some time before dawn, and made itself comfortable in the way London fog does when it is serious about staying. Not the thin, translucent variety that merely blurs the edges of things, but the proper, committal sort that turns the middle distance into grey velvet and makes the gas lamps, still burning at this hour, into small, personal suns surrounded by their own soft coronas. The motor car in front of the cab materialized gradually from the murk as they slowed behind it, and the buildings on either side of the street presented themselves one at a time, like modest acquaintances who do not wish to overwhelm. Ashworth had slept in the end, which surprised him. He had expected to lie awake in his Kensington flat, turning the problem over and over in the manner of a man who is committed to solving something, and cannot, in the dark hours, make himself put it down. Instead, he had fallen asleep with unusual speed, and woken feeling the particular clarity of someone whose sleeping mind has made a decision the waking one had been postponing. He had dressed carefully, not because the occasion demanded formality exactly, but because he was the kind of man who believed that presenting well was both a courtesy to the world and a form of personal discipline. And this belief did not take mornings off. Dark coat, good shoes, the third envelope still in his breast pocket alongside the second, and the expression he privately thought of as his "I am perfectly in command of the situation" expression, which was not entirely accurate, but was, he felt, a reasonable aspiration. He had telephoned ahead. This had felt like the correct approach. One did not simply arrive at the door of Sherlock Holmes at 9 in the morning without warning, as though dropping in for a social call. He had been connected, after some negotiation with the exchange, to the Baker Street number, and a woman's voice, practical, unhurried, faintly amused by the general fact of telephone calls, had confirmed that Mr. Holmes was in and would receive him. He had thanked her, and rung off, and felt, for the first time in 8 days, something that was almost, but not quite, relief. A promissory note of relief, perhaps. The sense that relief was a real thing that existed in the world, and might, at some point in the near future, be available to him. The cab turned north, and London changed texture around him. This was the thing about the city that Ashworth had never quite stopped finding remarkable, even after 26 years of living and working in it, the way it shifted, block by block, from one entirely different version of itself into another. The theatrical district, with its particular restless energy, its smell of paste and paint, and last night's applause still somehow lingering in the brickwork. The Strand's commerce, purposeful and slightly too loud. Then the quieter northward streets, the residential London, the London of steps and knockers and window boxes that had finished flowering for the year, and stood in their terracotta pots with the dignified emptiness of things that know perfectly well they will bloom again in spring. The further north you went toward Baker Street, the more London felt like a long, considered sentence, rather than a string of exclamations, measured, established, the kind of neighbourhood that had decided what it was several decades ago, and saw no particular reason to revise. Baker Street itself arrived without fanfare. The cab slowed, and the driver said the number, and Ashworth climbed out into air that tasted of fog and coal smoke and the very faint, bready warmth of a bakery somewhere nearby conducting its morning business. He paid, looked up at the familiar facade of 221B, and took a brief moment. Not hesitation, he told himself, simply a moment, to observe it. The building was exactly what it should be, Georgian proportion, the kind of solid London townhouse that had been built in an era when solidity was considered a virtue in architecture as in everything else, when the goal was not to impress, but to endure. The steps were clean. The brass knocker caught what thin light the fog was willing to permit, and returned it with quiet authority. In the first-floor window, just visible through the glass, a lamp was already burning, and the shadow of someone moving across the room passed once, unhurried, and disappeared. Ashworth climbed the steps and knocked. The door was opened by a woman of middle years and comfortable authority who looked at him with the expression of someone who has answered this door a very great number of times, and found that visitors fall, broadly, into two categories: those who are making a fuss about something that doesn't require it, and those who aren't, and was currently in the process of determining which he was. She was Mrs. Hudson, and she had the particular quality of people who have organized their lives around making other people's lives manageable, which is to say, she was both immovable and quietly indispensable. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, as though confirming a fact she had already known. "Do come in. I'll take your coat. Mind the third step. It's been uneven since Tuesday, and no one has seen fit to do anything about it." The hallway was warm in a way that felt deliberate, not the aggressive warmth of a room where someone has overcompensated for the cold outside, but the steady, established warmth of a house that keeps itself at a reliable temperature as a matter of principle. It smelled of beeswax and old paper and, very faintly, of something chemical and interesting from the upper floor. The ghost of an experiment, Ashworth thought, that had been concluded sometime in the last 24 hours. "Dr. Watson is already upstairs," Mrs. Hudson said, receiving his coat with the brisk competence of a woman who has received a great many coats and has opinions about all of them. "Mr. Holmes has been up since 6. I have brought them tea twice. I expect they will require a third pot by the time you're done, and I shall provide it under protest." She said this without any actual protest in her voice, which suggested it was a ritual observation rather than a genuine complaint. "Up you go then." He went up. The sitting room at the top of the stairs was, at first impression, a room in which a very great deal of thinking had been done, and the evidence had been allowed to accumulate. Books occupied their shelves with the slightly defensive confidence of books that are consulted rather than displayed. Papers were distributed across the desk in a system that appeared chaotic, and probably wasn't. A violin case sat open on a side table with the casual availability of something that might be picked up at any moment, though the instrument was currently at rest. Near the fireplace, where a good fire was conducting its steady business, 2 chairs faced each other across a low table, and in one of them sat Dr. Watson. Watson was a man who had spent enough years in various difficult circumstances to have arrived, somewhere in his 50s, at a quality that could only be described as settledness. He was not large or commanding in the way of men who require attention. He was simply thoroughly present, the kind of presence that a room adjusts to, rather than a presence that adjusts to the room. He had a good face, the face of a man who has listened carefully to a great many people, and found most of them interesting, and he rose when Ashworth entered with the unhurried warmth of someone who has been expecting a guest, and is genuinely pleased they've arrived. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, extending his hand, "I recognized your name immediately. My wife and I saw your Inspector Marlowe in the spring. Quite remarkable. Do sit down. Holmes will be a moment. He is finishing a thought, which generally takes precisely as long as it takes, and not a moment less." Ashworth shook his hand and sat, and found that the chair was unexpectedly comfortable, which felt, after 8 days of dressing-room floors and sleepless second-guessing, like a small act of mercy. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "I am aware that what I am here about may sound somewhat unusual," Watson suggested, settling back into his own chair with the ease of a man in familiar territory. "In my experience, the things that sound most unusual are generally the most interesting. Tea?" There was a pot already on the table between them, and Watson poured with the practised ease of a man who has been pouring tea in this room for a very long time. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows, and the fire made its quiet, continuous argument for warmth, and Ashworth felt something in his shoulders, some tension that had been resident there for the better part of a week. Release by perhaps half a degree. He accepted the tea. Holmes arrived in the manner of a man who has not been absent so much as occupied elsewhere, and has now directed his attention to the present room with the full, focused weight of a mind that when it chooses to attend to something, attends to it completely. He was taller than Ashworth had expected, with a quality of controlled stillness that reminded him, oddly, of the best actors he had known, the ones who understood that the audience watches what doesn't move as much as what does. He had grey eyes that performed when they settled on Ashworth, the slightly disconcerting feat of appearing to be reading him, rather than merely looking at him. He sat in the chair across from Watson, drew his dressing gown closer with the unhurried gesture of a man who considers comfort a reasonable working condition, and said, "The 3rd envelope arrived last night. You have the 2nd with you as well. The 1st you left at home, which you now consider an error. You slept better than you expected to. You're embarrassed about the nature of the case, but have concluded correctly that embarrassment is a poor substitute for clarity. Tell me about the moustache." Ashworth looked at him. Watson, who had seen this reaction before, said quietly, "He does that. You grow accustomed to it. Please do go on." Ashworth went on. He told it carefully and in sequence, beginning with the first evening he had noticed the tilted box, and ending with the empty drawer 2 nights ago. He described the envelopes, the handwriting, the specific wording of each note. He described the silver moustache itself, its construction, its provenance, its role in the production. with the slightly self-conscious precision of a man who is aware that the object in question is not obviously the kind of object that generates international intrigue. He placed the second and third envelopes on the low table, where Holmes regarded them without touching them for a moment, before picking each one up by its corner and reading it with the focused attention of someone for whom words are data, and data is everything. Watson listened throughout with the quality of attention that Ashworth was beginning to understand was characteristic of the man. Not passive, not simply waiting for the story to end, but actively present in it, following its shape, his expression shifting slightly at the details that mattered. "The tilting of the box," Holmes said when Ashworth had finished. 5 consecutive evenings before the theft. Always the same angle? Approximately. I can't be certain of the precise degree, but the impression was consistent, as though the same person was replacing it the same way each time. Which suggests practice, Holmes said, or oversight. A professional would replace it exactly, someone who was learning to be careful, but not yet careful enough. He set the third envelope down. The wording of the first note is interesting. We know about the moustache. Not, we have the moustache. They did not, at that point, have it. They knew something about it, something that prompted them to want it, and to threaten you into providing it, rather than simply taking it at the first opportunity. They took it eventually, Ashworth said. Yes. Which suggests the first approach, compliance via threat, failed to produce quick enough results for reasons they had not anticipated. The theft was, I think, improvised. The plan was the demand. The theft was the fallback. Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me about Gerald Finch." Ashworth blinked. How do you know about Finch?" "I don't," Holmes said. "You have mentioned the production, the theatre and the dressing room, and you have not mentioned the prop vault, which is where productions of this scale store their principal costume pieces. The name came from your expression when I said it, which confirmed that there is something about the prop vault that you have not yet told me. Gerald Finch, I would guess, is connected to it." Ashworth set down his teacup. The fire shifted behind its grate, and a coal dropped with a soft, inclusive sound, throwing a brief extra warmth across the room. "Finch is my understudy," he said. "He was found in the prop vault this morning. The stage manager telephoned me before I left home. He paused. "They believe he is dead." The sitting room was quiet for a moment. Watson set down his own cup with the careful deliberateness of a man recalibrating. Holmes did not move. His grey eyes had gone to the middle distance, the particular focused absence of someone whose mind has taken new information and begun, already, to build with it. "The vault is locked," Ashworth continued. "The stage manager said there was no sign of forced entry. Finch had a key. All the principal cast do. But the door was locked from the outside when they found him, which means, Holmes said, returning from wherever he had briefly been, that the case has become considerably more interesting than it appeared." He stood, with the decisive energy of a man who has been waiting for the point at which action becomes appropriate, and has now reached it. "Watson, your coat, I think. Mrs. Hudson will be deeply put out about the third pot of tea, but I'm afraid it will have to wait. Mr. Ashworth, you will come with us." Watson was already rising, with the ease of long practice, the ease of a man who has heard that particular tone in that particular voice for many years, and has learned that when it arrives, the correct response is simply to put on one's coat. "The Aldwych Theatre," Holmes said, already moving toward the door. He paused once, turned back, and picked up both envelopes from the table with the careful precision he had shown before. "These are evidence. You were right to bring them, and right to come this morning." He said it without ceremony, but with a directness that had the quality, rare, Ashworth found, in his experience of people, of being entirely meant. "Whatever someone knows about the moustache, Mr. Ashworth, we shall know it too, and probably rather more." Outside, the fog had not lifted. The street below was still grey velvet and soft lamplight, and the morning was still doing its unhurried work of becoming itself. But Ashworth, descending the uneven third step behind Watson, found that the sensation in his shoulders, the one he had been carrying for 8 days, like an unwanted piece of luggage, had shifted, not gone, but lighter somehow. The kind of lightness that comes not from the problem being solved, but from the problem being, for the first time, in the right hands. A cab was already pulling up to the curb. Holmes had, apparently, anticipated this. Ashworth followed him into it, and the door closed, and London received them back into its fog. The three of them moving now through the city's grey morning toward whatever the Aldwych Theatre held in its locked vault and its silent corridors, toward the centre of something that had begun 8 days ago, with a velvet box tilted at an angle of 20 degrees, and was becoming, with each passing hour, considerably larger than that. The cab moved north to south, and the fog moved with it, patient and unhurried, the way London's mysteries always are, as though the city has all the time in the world to reveal itself, and intends to do so at precisely its own pace, and not a moment before. The Aldwych Theatre in the morning was a different creature entirely from the Aldwych Theatre at night. At night, it was what it was designed to be. A place of transformation, of gaslight and shadow, and the collective agreement of several hundred people to believe, together, in something that wasn't quite real. The facade glowed, the doors breathed out warmth and chatter, and the whole building had the quality of something leaning slightly forward, attentive, alive with the particular electricity of performance. In the morning, with the fog still pressed against its stonework, and the box office shuttered, and the cleaners not yet arrived, it was simply a large Victorian building on a London street, solid and somewhat tired, wearing the previous evening's occupation the way a man wears last night's formal clothes, technically still presentable, but carrying the unmistakable evidence of having been used. Holmes stepped out of the cab and looked at it the way he looked at everything, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom the visible world is a continuous document, fully legible to those who know how to read it. Watson came down behind him, and then Ashworth, who had his key in hand before the cab had fully stopped. From some combination of habit and the anxious energy of a man who has been waiting to do something useful for 8 days, and is now, finally, within reach of doing it. The stage door was on the left side of the building, down a narrow passage that smelled of brick damp and yesterday's cigarette smoke, and the particular metallic cold of iron railings in November. A man was standing outside it, with the hunched, unhappy posture of someone who has been outside in the fog for longer than is reasonable, and has exhausted all available philosophical positions on the matter. This was Mr. Briggs, the stage manager, and his pipe was unlit, which Ashworth recognized as a reliable indicator of serious distress. Briggs was a compact man in his 50s, with a face that had been organized over the course of a long career in theatre management into an expression of permanent controlled anxiety. Not because he was an anxious person by nature, but because the job had gradually convinced him that vigilance was the only rational response to a world where anything might go wrong at any moment, and frequently did. He had sandy hair going grey at the temples, and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent decades standing in wings and backstage corridors where the ceiling was always slightly lower than it should have been. He looked at Ashworth with the expression of a man who is relieved that someone has arrived, and simultaneously uncertain whether the someone in question is going to make things better or more complicated. Then he looked at Holmes, and his expression shifted to something more carefully neutral. The look of a man who doesn't know what he is looking at, but has sufficient experience of the world to should. The door is still. He stopped. Should. The door is still. He stopped himself, reassembled, and tried again. He's still in there. Mr. Briggs, Ashworth said, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. I have asked them to come. Briggs looked at Holmes for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating several things at once. Right, he said after a moment, in the tone of someone who has decided that unusual solutions are preferable to usual problems. Right. Well, come in then. The stage door opened into a corridor that was the working spine of the theatre, not the part the audience ever saw, but the part that made the part the audience saw possible. It was lit by bare electric bulbs that gave the brick walls a yellowish, functional light entirely unlike the warm glow of the auditorium. The floor was stone, worn smooth in the center of the walkway by decades of feet, and the walls were hung with the practical apparatus of theatrical production. Call sheets and costume plots and scenic diagrams in various states of completion. A corkboard dense with pinned notes, a row of hooks bearing coats and scarves, and the kind of heavy-duty canvas aprons that stagehands wear when moving scenery. It smelled of sawdust and size, that particular theatrical adhesive used in scenic construction, sharp and slightly sweet. And underneath those, the deeper, accumulated smell of the building itself, of old timber and cold stone, and the ghost of 100 productions. Holmes was already attending to the corridor as they walked, his gaze moving across the walls and floor with the methodical interest of someone reading a page. He said nothing, asked no questions, but Ashworth noticed his pace was slightly slower than was strictly necessary to follow Briggs, the pace of a man who is looking at things and does not want to pass anything before it has been properly seen. When was he found? Watson asked. He had produced a small notebook from his coat pocket with the practised ease of long habit. 7:30, Briggs said. Jimmy Dokes, one of my stagehands, been here 15 years. Comes in early to open up and check the fly system before the rest of the crew. He came past the prop vault, which is along here to the left, and noticed the key wasn't on its hook. He gestured toward a panel on the corridor wall where a row of labelled hooks held various keys. One hook, labelled Prop Vault Master, was empty. The vault door was shut and locked, and the key was in the lock, on the outside, which isn't... he paused. We don't lock it from the outside when someone's inside. That's the rule. Has been for years. There's no handle on the inside, only the lock mechanism, and if it's locked from outside and the key's in it, there is no way to open it from within, Holmes said. Not a key. Question. Correct. It's a heavy door, original to the building. Briggs stopped at a door set into the left wall of the corridor. It was, as described, heavy, solid timber in a stone frame with iron hinges and a substantial lock of Victorian manufacture. A key was in the lock. The door was shut. I unlocked it when Jimmy found it, just to check. Then I locked it again and haven't let anyone else near it. Sensible, Holmes said, with what appeared to be genuine approval. He bent to examine the lock and the key with the focused attention of a watchmaker examining a movement. Watson positioned himself slightly behind and to the left, watching Holmes work with the comfortable familiarity of a man who has stood in this relationship to this process for many years. Ashworth stood further back, which felt correct. He had been here long enough to understand that he was not, in this corridor, an investigator. He was a witness, a subject, a man standing at the edge of something he had been inside for 8 days without understanding it, finally watching someone who did understand begin to make sense of it. The lock shows no signs of forced manipulation, Holmes said, straightening. The key is the original. You can tell by the wear pattern on the bow, consistent with years of regular use. Someone locked this door with the correct key from the outside, and then he paused, looking at the key with a particular expression, and then placed the key in the lock, rather than removing it. Why? He said this as though it were a question addressed to the corridor rather than to any person in it, which Ashworth was beginning to understand was simply how Holmes thought. Aloud, in a running conversation with the evidence. "May I?" Holmes said to Briggs. Briggs nodded. Holmes turned the key, and the door opened. The prop vault was a long, low room that ran the width of the backstage area, lit by a single electric bulb on a cord. It smelled of canvas and paint, and the dry, dusty, particular smell of old things being kept in a confined space. The smell, Ashworth thought, of theatrical memory. The shelves that lined both walls held the accumulated props of a dozen productions. Boxes and bottles and artificial flowers and framed photographs and hats on stands and a collection of walking sticks arranged in a wooden rack, and, at the far end, a section of hanging costume pieces draped in cloth covers. The floor was stone, bare, without any of the decorative provision of the public areas above. It was a working room, purely functional, organized in the precise, idiosyncratic way of someone, almost certainly Briggs, Ashworth thought, who kept everything and forgot nothing. Gerald Finch was on the floor at the far end of the room, near the hanging costumes, in the collapsed, deeply unambiguous posture of a man who had not sat down by choice. He was on his side, one arm extended, his face turned away from the door. He was dressed in his own clothes, not costume, but the ordinary clothes of a man who had come to a theatre outside of performance hours. A dark wool coat, grey trousers, leather shoes that were still damp, Ashworth noticed, from the previous evening's rain. Watson crossed the room to him with the quiet efficiency of a doctor who has been in enough serious situations to have organized his responses to them into something functional and unhesitating. He knelt, made his examination, and after a moment looked up at Holmes with the expression that confirmed what they had all understood from the moment Briggs had telephoned. "He has been dead some hours," Watson said. "Since last night, I would estimate, though I will want to be more precise. There are no immediately visible wounds, but," he paused, leaning slightly closer, "there is a faint smell here that I recognize. Chemical. Sweet, almost. Consistent with several compounds I encountered during my time in various—" He glanced at Briggs, and would not have known much about it. Would not have known much about it. "Administered how?" Holmes asked. He was moving slowly along the perimeter of the room, examining the shelves, the floor, the walls. Inhaled, most likely, given the setting. Watson stood. A cloth or a container broken nearby. Holmes stopped at a point approximately 8 feet from where Finch lay. He bent over one of the lower shelves and remained bent for several seconds. When he straightened, his expression had the quality that Ashworth was beginning to learn to read. Not excitement exactly, but a particular sharpening. The look of a man who has found something that fits. "There," he said to Watson, not touching anything, simply indicating. "Third shelf from the floor, between the wooden box and the bundle of stage rope. Do you see the residue?" Watson came and looked. Yes, a glass container of some kind, broken fragments and a stain on the shelf surface. Quite small, something that could be carried in a coat pocket. And placed, I think, on that shelf while Finch was occupied elsewhere in the room. The door was locked. He became incapacitated before he could reach it. And then— Holmes paused. Then the person who locked the door did so from outside, having already ensured that Finch would not be leaving. The key left in the lock is interesting. It suggests either haste or a deliberate signal. A signal to whom? Ashworth asked. He had stayed near the door, not because he was asked to, but because some instinct for self-preservation in enclosed spaces with dead men was, he found, rather more developed than he had previously known. Holmes turned to look at him, to whoever was meant to find this. The key in the lock is not an accidental oversight. A professional does not make that kind of mistake. It is a message. The question is whether the message was intended for us or for someone else who has not yet arrived. He looked back at the room. The silver moustache box is not here. "You were looking for it?" Ashworth said. "I was noting its absence. There is a space on the second shelf," Holmes indicated without pointing, "where the dust has been disturbed in a rectangular pattern consistent with a small box. Something was kept here and recently removed. Before Finch's death or after is not yet clear, but the dust displacement is recent, within the last 2 or 3 days. Ashworth looked at the shelf. The empty space was exactly the right size. "The moustache was kept in the prop vault," he said slowly, "not just in my dressing room. It appears there may have been 2 points of storage," Holmes said, "or a second copy of the prop. Or, more interestingly, someone was using the prop vault as a secondary location for something kept inside the moustache itself." He said this with the measured calm of a man presenting a hypothesis, not a conclusion. "The moustache must be found, but first," he looked at Watson, "we need to send for the police, document this room before it is disturbed further, and have a careful conversation with every person who held a key to this vault." He turned to Briggs. "How many keys are there?" Briggs, who had been standing in the doorway with the expression of a man who had come in this morning expecting a routine day and was now revising that expectation comprehensively, said, "3. The master, which is the one in the lock, and 2 copies, One belongs to me. One belongs to—" He stopped. "Yes," Holmes said. "One belongs to Gerald Finch," Briggs said. Holmes looked at the body, and then at the door, and then at the empty space on the second shelf where something had recently been. Then someone, he said, with the quiet certainty of a man placing the final word of a sentence he has been constructing for several minutes, used Gerald Finch's key to lock Gerald. Finch inside his own vault. He moved toward the door. And that someone is still, I think, somewhere in this building. The fog outside was pressing against the high, narrow window at the far end of the vault, a window, Ashworth noticed now, that was small and fixed and entirely incapable of opening. There was no other exit. The room had one door and one locked mechanism, and a dead man and the smell of something chemical, sweet and faint, still present in the cold air. Watson was writing in his notebook. Holmes was already in the corridor. Ashworth took one last look at Gerald Finch, at his dark coat still damp from last night's rain, at his extended arm, at the ordinary leather shoes of a man who had walked into this room under his own power and not walked out. And then he followed Holmes into the corridor and pulled the vault door closed behind him. The key was still in the lock. Holmes looked at it for a moment, then looked at Ashworth with an expression that was not reassurance exactly, but was the thing that precedes reassurance. The look of a man who has seen enough of the shape of a problem to know that the shape, however unpleasant, is finite, that it has edges, that those edges can be traced. "We shall need," Holmes said, "to speak to everyone who was in this theatre last night. The stage manager, the cast, the crew, the costume department, every person, starting with whoever was the last to see Finch alive." He began walking back toward the stage door. "And I shall want to know considerably more about the silver moustache than its dimensions and provenance." "I've told you everything I know about it," Ashworth said. Holmes glanced back at him, briefly, with the grey eyes that had the quality of reading rather than looking. "Yes," he said, "which is precisely why it is interesting." The police arrived at 9:30. They came in the form of Inspector Lestrade, not the original, who had long since retired to a cottage in Surrey, and a garden that reportedly gave him considerably more trouble than any criminal he had ever pursued. But his successor in temperament, if not in blood, Inspector Calloway, who had the broad shoulders and the slightly compressed expression of a man who has spent his career being presented with situations that don't fit neatly into the categories available to him, and has developed over time a working relationship with this fact. He shook Holmes's hand with the careful respect of someone who has been told by several reliable sources that the correct approach to Sherlock Holmes is to be grateful for his presence and not ask too many questions about his methods. "Natural causes," Calloway said, looking at Watson, because Watson was a doctor, and doctors were the appropriate people to ask about bodies. "Decidedly not," Watson said pleasantly. Calloway wrote something in his notebook and accepted this with the resignation of a man who had, in truth, not genuinely expected the answer to be yes. While Calloway's men documented the vault with the methodical thoroughness of official procedure, Holmes moved through the backstage corridors of the Aldwych with Ashworth as his guide and Watson as his recording shadow, conducting the series of conversations that Holmes called interviews, and which were, Ashworth noted, rather unlike any interview he had encountered before. They were not interrogations. They were not even precisely conversations, in the social sense. They were something more like Holmes, thinking aloud in the presence of other people, and occasionally requiring those people to contribute a specific fact, which they generally did, often without entirely understanding why they had been asked for it. The first of these conversations was with the leading lady, Miss Cecily Hartwell, and Ashworth noticed Holmes register the name without any visible change of expression, which was itself a kind of expression. Was in her dressing room when they knocked, sitting before her mirror, in a cream dressing gown with her dark hair pinned up, and her face in the intermediate state between yesterday's makeup removed and today's not yet applied, which is to say in the state of being entirely and uncomplicatedly herself, which she managed with the self-possession of a woman who has never particularly needed artifice for confidence. She was perhaps 35, with the kind of considered composure that the stage either builds or destroys, depending on the person, and, in her case, had clearly built, with considerable thoroughness. She received Holmes and Watson and Ashworth into her dressing room without surprise, and without the flutter of affected distress that Ashworth had half expected, given the morning's events. She had heard about Finch. Her expression, when she confirmed this, was genuinely sorrowful. A brief, real grief, quickly contained, the grief of someone who had liked a person without knowing them particularly well, which is its own category of loss. Gerald was a careful young man, she said, quiet, reliable. He had been Ashworth's understudy for 2 seasons, and never once, not once, made a fuss about it, which is more than I can say for most understudies I have worked with, and I have worked with a considerable number. She paused. He was here last night, after the performance. I saw him in the corridor near the prop vault at approximately 10:15. He seemed perfectly normal. He nodded to me. He was carrying something, a folder, I think, or a case of some kind. A case, Holmes said. What sort of case? Narrow, dark leather, the kind a musician might carry scores in, or, she stopped, considering, or the kind used for technical drawings, long and flat. Did you speak to him? I said good night. He said good night. That was all. Holmes thanked her with the brevity of a man who has what he came for, and they left. The costume mistress was found in the wardrobe room, which occupied a long space on the upper backstage level and smelled, with great authority, of camphor and ironing, and the warm, slightly organic smell of old fabric that has been carefully kept. Her name was Mrs. Alma Petch, and she was a woman of formidable organizational capability who kept the production's costume inventory in a ledger of such meticulous detail that Holmes spent a full 2 minutes examining it with the expression he normally reserved for exceptionally interesting chemical analyses. The silver moustache, Holmes said, setting the ledger down. It is listed here as a principal prop, stored in the prop vault, but Mr. Ashworth kept a box for it in his dressing room as well. He did, Mrs. Petch said, in the tone of someone who has learned to accommodate the organizational habits of principal actors without necessarily endorsing them. The vault copy was the original. Mr. Ashworth's box was his personal preference. He likes to have his principal props nearby before a performance, which I understand perfectly well, and so I made him a second fitted box for the dressing room. The moustache itself was moved between the 2 locations depending on the day. Who knew about the vault copy? Mrs. Petch looked at him over her spectacles. Anyone who read the prop inventory, which is to say, myself, Mr. Briggs, the prop master, Mr. Dokes, Mr. Finch, and anyone else who had occasion to consult it. It is not a secret document. It is an inventory." "Quite," Holmes said. "And when was the vault copy last confirmed present?" Mrs. Petch consulted her ledger with the efficiency of a woman who has never in her professional life been unable to find a specific entry. 3 days ago, I checked the vault inventory on Tuesday morning. Everything was present and accounted for." She paused, "including the silver moustache." Holmes stood. "One more question, Mrs. Petch. The name Hartwell, specifically as a surname, not as Miss Cecily's. Does it mean anything to you in connection with this production?" Mrs. Petch thought for a moment. Then she said carefully, "There was a man, not connected to the production, not cast or crew. He came to the stage door approximately 2 weeks ago asking for Mr. Finch. I happened to be passing. The doorman told me afterward that the man had given his name as Hartwell." The wardrobe room was quiet for a moment. The iron on its stand ticked gently as it cooled. "Thank you," Holmes said, and meant it. They took their mid-morning pause in the theatre's green room, which was what theatre people called the common room backstage, a name whose origin is disputed and whose current incarnation in the Aldwych was a somewhat battered but genuinely comfortable space with mismatched armchairs and a small gas ring on which someone had, with admirable initiative, placed a kettle. Watson found 3 cups of reasonable cleanliness and poured tea with the domestic efficiency that Ashworth was beginning to think of as one of the man's defining characteristics, and the 3 of them sat in the armchairs, while the fog shifted outside the single high window, and the theatre settled around them into its midday quiet. Holmes had his fingertips together and his eyes on the middle distance. Watson drank his tea. Ashworth held his cup and waited, because he was beginning to understand that this, the stillness, the silence, the appearance of nothing happening, was in fact something happening, and that interrupting it would be the equivalent of speaking during a delicate surgical procedure. The educational layer of the 1920s theatre world had been assembling itself, piece by piece, through the morning's conversations, not as a lecture, but as texture, the way historical detail always embeds itself most effectively, which is through the specific and the human. The world of the Aldwych was a world of extraordinary social complexity, compressed into a small physical space. The rigid hierarchy of the billing were ones. Position on the programme was a precise and jealously maintained social index. The particular status of the understudy, permanently adjacent to importance without ever quite arriving at it, required to know everything, and acknowledged for nothing. The costume mistress's quiet sovereignty over an empire of fabric and inventory that the actors depended on entirely and thought about hardly at all. The stage manager's role as the true operational centre of the whole enterprise, the persons who actually made the performance happen while everyone else received the applause. It was, Ashworth thought, not entirely unlike the diplomatic world. Layers of visible hierarchy over a quite different operational reality, with information flowing along channels that had nothing to do with official titles. "The microfilm?" Holmes said suddenly, to the middle distance. Watson looked up. Ashworth looked up. "The moustache concealed something," Holmes continued, in the tone of someone resuming a conversation that had been happening for the last 20 minutes, entirely inside his own head. "The demand, we know about the moustache, bring it to a left luggage office. is not the language of someone who wants a theatrical prop. It is the language of someone who wants what is inside a theatrical prop. A prop that has been in continuous production use for 2 seasons, moved regularly between the dressing room and the prop vault, handled by multiple people, stored in a building with numerous points of access. He paused. It is, in fact, an almost ideal method of storage for something small, valuable, and best kept moving. No fixed address, no obvious container, hidden inside the most visible object on the stage. Watson set down his cup. You're saying someone used the moustache as a dead drop? I am saying the moustache was used as storage for something. My current hypothesis is photographic in nature, given the dimensions described and the involvement of a name connected to diplomatic circles, and that the people who wanted it either did not have direct access to it, or could not retrieve it cleanly from its location, and therefore chose to extract it through Ashworth. Holmes looked at Ashworth. You were never really the subject of this. You were the mechanism, the most direct path to a prop that was otherwise too well observed to simply take. Ashworth absorbed this. And Finch, he said. Finch knew something, Holmes said, or had something. The leather case Miss Hartwell observed. I think he had retrieved whatever was hidden in the moustache before the theft occurred. Whether he took it for himself, or was given it for safekeeping, or found it accidentally, is not yet clear. But the person who visited the stage door 2 weeks ago, the man who called himself Hartwell, was not conducting a social call. He was either warning Finch or instructing him. Holmes stood, with the decisive energy that signalled the end of a thinking pause and the beginning of its practical consequence. The case must be found, and I want to look at the dressing room where the original theft occurred. Watson produced his notebook. Ashworth set down his tea. The green room kettle, cooling on its ring, made a small, soft, settling sound, as things do when the heat that was keeping them at tension is gradually, carefully removed. Ashworth's dressing room, in the flat grey light of a November morning, was smaller than it felt during performance hours. This was a thing he had noticed before, the way spaces contract when emptied of their purpose. At night, with the mirror lit and the costumes laid out, and the particular focused energy of pre-performance settling over everything like a second atmosphere, the room had a quality of expansion, as though the act of getting ready to become someone else inflated the space around it. In the morning, with the bulbs cold and the costumes hanging still and the surfaces cleared of everything, except what was permanently resident, it was simply a rectangular room with a table and a mirror, and a row of hooks and a window that looked onto a narrow passage. Holmes moved into it and stood in the centre for a moment, turning slowly, with the quality of a compass finding north. Watson positioned himself near the door. Ashworth stayed just inside the threshold, watching Holmes the way he had, over the course of a long career, watched directors with the particular attention of someone who understands that the person moving through the space is reading something in it that he himself cannot yet see, and that the correct response to this is patience. The window, Holmes said. I looked at it, Ashworth said. The night the box went missing. The latch is loose. Holmes was already at it, examining the frame with the close attention he gave to everything. The latch mechanism, the gap at the sill, the exterior ledge visible through the glass. The window was perhaps 18 inches wide and looked onto the service passage. A gap of perhaps 4 feet between the theatre's exterior wall and the adjacent building's blank face, barely wide enough to turn around in, lit at this hour by whatever pale light the fog permitted to filter between the roof lines. "Opened from outside," Holmes said. "Not a question. The latch is a simple lever, insufficient resistance for its purpose, which is common in these older buildings, where the expectation was that no one would bother. Someone in the passage, with a thin implement, a knife blade, a letter opener, anything with sufficient rigidity and a narrow profile, could work this open from outside in perhaps 30 seconds. He turned the latch, pushed the window out, leaned briefly into the passage, pulled back. There are marks on the exterior sill, recent, consistent with someone bracing against it from below, which means they use something to stand on. A crate, most likely, given the height. The passage connects to the rear of the building at both ends. Either exit leads to a public street. So the theft was straightforward, Ashworth said. The mechanics of the theft were straightforward, Holmes said. The planning was not. He left the window and moved to the dressing table, where he stood, looking at the second drawer, the one that held the velvet box, with the expression of a man reading a page that has been partially erased. The tilting of the box over 5 consecutive evenings. That is what interests me, not the theft, the rehearsal. Watson looked up from his notebook. Someone was practicing, Holmes continued, entering through the window, opening the drawer, examining the box, replacing it, exiting. 5 times. Not to take it. They were not yet ready to take it. They were learning the room, establishing the route, confirming that the box was consistently present, consistently positioned. He paused. And then, when they were ready, the 6th entry was my own inattention. That was my own inattention. That was precisely the intention, Holmes said. A small wrongness, consistently produced, that the occupant would attribute to himself rather than to intrusion. It is rather elegant, in its way, the kind of misdirection that works best on careful, observant people, because careful, observant people are the most likely to find a rational explanation for an anomaly and the most reluctant to conclude that they are being systematically deceived. He glanced at Ashworth with what might, in another man, have been sympathy. You were not careless, you were managed. This was not precisely comforting, but it had the quality of being accurate, which Ashworth found, on balance, preferable to comfortable inaccuracy. Holmes crossed to the hooks on the wall, where the costumes for the current production hung in their cloth covers. Inspector Marlowe's overcoat, his evening dress, and, at the end of the row, the final act costume. The full evening suit with its particular distinction. The costume Ashworth wore when he put on the silver moustache and became for 8 minutes the most famous fictional detective in the West End. Holmes lifted the edge of the cloth cover on the final act costume and looked at it, then released it. "Tell me about the final act," Holmes said. "The costume changes. The specific sequence of movement backstage." Ashworth considered. "I come off stage at the end of Act 3 for the interval between scenes, about 4 minutes. The dresser helps me change into the evening suit. I return for the opening of Act 4, which runs approximately 22 minutes. And then there is a brief off-stage moment, perhaps 90 seconds, before the final scene. During the final scene, I put on the moustache. Who applies it? I apply it. Myself. It goes on in the wings. There is a small makeup station in the stage right wing for last-minute adjustments. The prop is usually brought to me there by—" He stopped. "By the prop runner," he said slowly. "Who is Gerald Finch?" Watson had stopped writing. Holmes said nothing for a moment, which was itself a kind of response. "Finch handled the moustache every performance," Ashworth said, working through it. "He brought it from the vault, carried it to the wing, handed it to me." "And returned it to the vault afterward," Holmes said. "Yes." So Finch had regular, unremarkable, entirely above-board access to the moustache on a nightly basis, Holmes said. He could examine it, handle it, open the box, inspect its contents, whatever was hidden within, without attracting any attention whatsoever, because doing so was his job. The dressing room was quiet. The window latch, slightly loose in its frame, moved almost imperceptibly in the draught from the passage outside. "He wasn't an innocent victim," Ashworth said. "I don't think he was entirely innocent, no," Holmes said, with the measured tone of a man making a precise distinction. "I think he knew what he was carrying. Whether he knew the full nature of what was concealed, whether he was acting under instruction, or on his own initiative, whether he was a principal or a peripheral, those questions are not yet answered. But the leather case that Miss Hartwell observed him carrying last night, I believe he had retrieved the contents of the moustache, either because he was told to, or because he had decided, for reasons of his own, that holding them was a more advantageous position than simply transporting them." "And someone disagreed with that position," Watson said quietly. "Emphatically," Holmes said. They walked the route. This was Holmes's suggestion, to move through the backstage geography in the sequence a person would have used on the night of Finch's death, beginning at the stage, door and ending at the prop vault, tracing the path that the evening's movements would have described. It was, Ashworth thought, the theatrical instinct made analytical, the director's habit of walking the blocking before rehearsal, of understanding the space through the body's passage, through it, rather than through description alone. The theatre's backstage was a maze, in the specific way that all working backstage spaces become mazes over time, not by design, but by accumulation, as generations of productions added their organizational requirements to a fixed physical space, and the space adapted by generating corridors, alcoves, storage annexes, and the kind of intermediate spaces that appear on no official plan, but are known, by long habit, to everyone who works there. There were at least 3 routes between the stage door and the prop vault, each with different visibility, different likelihood of encounter, different transit time. Holmes walked all 3. On the second route, the one that passed behind the fly tower, through the narrow gap between the scene dock and the rear wall, he stopped at a point perhaps halfway along, and crouched to examine the floor. The floor here was stone, like the rest of the backstage, but here it was darker, slightly tacky underfoot, in a way that was not quite the ordinary grime of a working theatre floor. "Watson?" he said. Watson crouched beside him, examined, straightened. "A spill. Chemical. Similar in type to what we found in the vault. Not identical, but related. As if someone carried a container along this route and it leaked slightly. Or was tested here first," Holmes said. "A small preliminary test, checking the effectiveness of the delivery mechanism before using it in the vault." He stood, looking along the route. The person who did this was not improvising. This was planned over days. The same person who practiced the window entry, who prepared the chemical compound, who arranged the meeting with Finch under the name Hartwell. This is a careful, patient, methodical person. He paused. Which is to say, this is a person very like myself, operating on the other side of the question. He said this without vanity and without humour, as a simple analytical observation, the way a navigator notes a current. Watson caught Ashworth's eye briefly and gave the small, fractional expression of a man communicating. Yes, he really does talk like this, and yes, you do grow accustomed to it. They reached the prop vault. Calloway's men had finished their documentation and gone, leaving the door locked and the corridor empty. Holmes unlocked it, entered, and went directly to the section of hanging costume pieces at the far end, the area nearest to where Finch had been found. He moved along the hanging rail slowly, pushing each covered costume gently aside to look at what was behind it. Behind the third costume from the end, he found the dark leather case. It was exactly as Miss Hartwell had described: narrow, flat, the kind of case used for technical drawings or scores. Holmes did not open it. He held it, turned it over, examined the clasp and the surface leather with great attention, and then set it carefully on the nearest shelf. Finch hid it here, Ashworth said. He came to the vault, hid the case, and was then intercepted, Holmes said. The person who followed him here, or who was already here, or who had arranged to meet him here, that sequence is still unclear. But the case was hidden first. He had time to conceal it, which means the confrontation happened after the hiding, not before. He looked at the case. He was protecting it. From the person who killed him, Watson said, or for the person who sent him. It depends on which side he was on, which, as I said, is not yet fully clear. Holmes looked at the case for a long moment, then opened it. Inside, in a slim-fitted interior, was a strip of photographic film, perhaps 4 inches, long, translucent, each frame tiny and precise. Ashworth leaned in, looked at it without touching, and said, "That was inside the moustache." "Inside the moustache," Holmes confirmed. "Sewn, I would think, into the backing material, small enough to be invisible without specific examination. Moved nightly, handled by multiple people, stored in a building with regular turnover. The ideal container." He held the strip up to the vault's single electric bulb. The images were too small to resolve at this distance, but the strip itself was clearly photographic, clearly documentary. Diplomatic correspondence, I would guess. Letters, memoranda, something that was never meant to leave a specific room and did so regardless. "And several people wanted it back," Watson said. "Several people wanted it," Holmes said. "Whether any of them had a legitimate claim is a different question entirely." He replaced the strip in the case, closed it, and stood holding it with the careful deliberateness of someone who has picked up an object and intends to keep hold of it until the appropriate moment. The person operating under the name Hartwell, who visited Finch, who sent the envelopes, who entered this dressing room 5 times in practice and once in earnest, is still, I believe, connected to this theatre. He looked at Ashworth. "The performance tonight," he said, "is it proceeding?" Ashworth blinked. "Briggs hasn't cancelled it. I think he intended to decide this afternoon." "It should proceed," Holmes said. "Tell Mr. Briggs it should proceed." He moved toward the vault door with the quiet certainty of a man who has identified the point toward which everything has been building, and is now simply moving in its direction. There is a particular type of person who cannot stay away from the scene of their own misdirection. They return, not from foolishness, but from the need to confirm that the misdirection has held, that the mirrors are still in the right positions, that no one is looking where they shouldn't be looking. He paused at the door. "We shall be looking," he said, "exactly where we shouldn't be." The evening performance of the Inspector's Gambit proceeded as scheduled. Briggs had received Holmes's recommendation with the expression of a man who has, over the course of a long career, learned to recognize the difference between advice and instruction, and had understood correctly that this was the latter delivered in the grammatical form of the former. He had posted the call sheet, informed the cast that the evening's performance would go ahead as a mark of professional respect for Gerald Finch, and had then stood in his office for a long moment, with his unlit pipe, and the particular face of a man who is holding a great many things together by main force, and intends to continue doing so until relieved. The cast had taken the news of Finch's death in the various ways that people take unexpected death, with shock, with grief, with the slightly guilty relief of those not directly affected, and with the professional stoicism of people who have been trained by vocation to perform under difficult circumstances. The leading lady had been composed. The supporting cast had been subdued. The dresser who had worked most closely with Finch had wept briefly in the wardrobe room, and then returned to work, which Mrs. Petch had observed without comment, and with the provision of a clean handkerchief. Holmes had spent the afternoon in a manner that he did not fully explain, and which Watson recorded in his notebook as various inquiries, details to follow, which was Watson's diplomatic shorthand for Holmes going somewhere and doing something that would make complete sense in retrospect, and was not, in the moment, entirely explicable. He had returned to the theatre at 6:30 with the expression of a man who has confirmed several hypotheses, and is now waiting for the evidence to arrange itself into the shape he has already, privately, identified. Ashworth had performed. This was, in its own way, the most remarkable thing about the evening, that he had stood in the wings in his Act I costume, listening to the house filling on the other side of the curtain, and had felt the familiar pre-performance settling occur, the way it always occurred, regardless of what else was happening in the world outside the stage. The theatre had its own gravity. It pulled you into its present tense. Whatever was wrong, whatever was unresolved, whatever was waiting in the prop vault or the green room or the calculating mind of Sherlock Holmes, on this side of the curtain, for these 2 hours and 40 minutes, you were Inspector Marlowe, and Inspector Marlowe had other problems entirely. He had performed well. He thought Finch would have found this appropriate. Holmes had positioned Watson at the stage door, Briggs, now fully briefed, at the fly gallery above the backstage corridor, himself in the prop vault anteroom, which was a small alcove opposite the vault door, used for storing equipment too large for the shelves inside. He had arranged this with the quiet efficiency of a man setting a stage, which was, Ashworth reflected afterward, precisely what it was. The person came during Act 3. Watson heard the stage door open at 9:22, during the sustained applause following the Act 3 revelation scene, which Holmes had correctly identified as the point of maximum noise and minimum backstage movement. A figure in a dark coat moved through the stage door with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been in this building before and knows its geography. Watson followed at a distance that Holmes had specified, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid detection, and watched the figure move directly, without hesitation, toward the backstage corridor. Not toward the prop vault, toward the dressing rooms. Watson altered course accordingly, and sent a sharp knock, the agreed signal, against the corridor pipe that ran the length of the backstage wall. Holmes heard it in the anteroom, and was in the corridor in 4 seconds. The figure had reached Ashworth's dressing room and was inside, the door not fully closed, a thin line of light from within falling across the stone floor. Holmes moved to the door and pushed it open with the calm deliberateness of a man who is not surprised by what he finds. The woman inside turned. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of contained, intelligent face that manages to be simultaneously unremarkable and entirely memorable. The face of someone who has spent considerable time being precisely as visible as she chooses to be, and no more. She was at the dressing table, the second drawer open, her hands still in the act of searching. She had dark eyes and good gloves, and the expression now of someone who has been caught in the middle of something, and is already, in the same instant, deciding how to respond to having been caught. She looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at her. "Miss Adler," Holmes said pleasantly, "or whichever name you are currently using, I am afraid the drawer is empty, as you already know, since you arranged for it to be emptied." Watson arrived in the doorway behind Holmes. The woman looked at Watson, then back at Holmes, and then did something that neither of them had quite expected. She sat down in Ashworth's chair with the composed deliberateness of someone accepting a situation, and said, "How long have you known?" "Since this morning," Holmes said. The name Hartwell was the confirmation, not the discovery. Miss Hartwell is your alias of record in this particular operation, consistent with the left luggage instruction in the 3rd envelope, where the package was to be addressed to Hartwell. You used the same name when visiting Finch at the stage door, which was careless, but suggests you were working under time pressure by that point. He moved into the room and took the chair opposite her, the second chair, the one that sat against the wall for visitors, with the unhurried ease of a man settling in for a conversation he has been preparing for all day. "Finch was your contact," Holmes continued. He had been placing the microfilm in the Moustache's backing material and retrieving it on a rotating schedule. A dead drop system using a prop that moved nightly and was handled by multiple people, making surveillance extremely difficult. It was elegant. Finch was careful, reliable, and entirely above suspicion because his role in handling the prop was entirely legitimate. A brief pause. What went wrong? The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He decided to negotiate." "Ah," Holmes said. "He had been reliable for 8 months. Then he decided that what he was carrying was worth more than what he was being paid to carry it. And he made contact. Not with me, with the other side. He told them he had the film and would sell it to the higher bidder." She said this without heat, with the flat precision of someone reporting a mechanical failure. "I learned of this 4 days ago. I had already sent the letters to Ashworth as a contingency, in case the Moustache needed to be moved through a different channel. When I understood what Finch intended, I came to retrieve the film directly. And Finch Watson said from the doorway. She looked at Watson. Finch made a choice. He understood the nature of the work he was doing. The consequences of that choice are not something I arranged lightly. She said this with something that was not quite regret, but was its near neighbour, the expression of someone for whom the moral arithmetic of a situation has been done correctly, and the answer was not comfortable. Holmes regarded her for a moment with the grey eyes that read, rather than looked. "The film," he said, "its contents. Correspondence between a British diplomatic attaché and a party that would find it very useful to know which British diplomatic attachés are willing to conduct unauthorized correspondence," she said. "It doesn't belong in the hands of that party. It belongs," she paused, "elsewhere." "In your hands," Holmes said. "In the right hands," she said. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Watson watched him from the doorway with the expression of a man who has stood in this position before, watching Holmes at the precise point where the law and the thing that is right sit at an angle to each other, and knows better than to say anything that would complicate the calculation. "Inspector Calloway," Holmes said finally, "is waiting in the green room. He is aware that an arrest is expected tonight in connection with Finch's death. He is not aware of the specifics." Another pause. "The film is in my possession. It will be passed to the appropriate authority tomorrow morning through a channel that does not require your involvement." He stood. "You will go with Watson to speak with Calloway. You will tell him what he needs to know about Finch's death. You will not tell him what he does not need to know about the film." He moved toward the door. "This is not leniency. It is precision." She looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't changed," she said, with something that might have been the very distant edge of a smile. "You have," Holmes said pleasantly. "You're considerably more careful than you were. It is, if I may say so, an improvement." He held the door. She stood, smoothed her gloves, and walked through it. The case was concluded by Thursday. The diplomatic matter was resolved through channels that left no official trace and required no official acknowledgement, which is the particular frictionless resolution available only to problems that were never officially acknowledged in the first place. The microfilm passed from Holmes's custody to a quiet office in Whitehall, whose nameplate was modest to the point of anonymity, and the man who received it asked no questions about its provenance and answered none about its destination, which suited everyone involved. Ashworth was told only what he needed to know, which was that the matter was closed, and his name would not appear in connection with it anywhere. He received this information in the 221B sitting room on Thursday morning, over tea that Mrs. Hudson provided, without protest for once, possibly because she sensed that the occasion warranted a temporary suspension of her ritual objections. The silver moustache was returned to him in its velvet box. Holmes produced it from the desk drawer with the unhurried casualness of a man returning a borrowed book, and set it on the table between them without ceremony. Ashworth picked it up, opened it, looked at the silver wire and crystal beads with the particular feeling of someone examining a familiar object that has been, without his knowledge, living a secret life. It had considerable hidden talents, Holmes said. "So I understand," Ashworth said. 8 months as an unwitting diplomatic courier, Holmes continued, with the dry satisfaction of a man who finds the irony professionally pleasing. Inspector Marlowe carrier of state secrets. It would make rather a good plot for your next production, I should think, though I would recommend changing several of the details. Several, Watson said, from his chair by the fire, without looking up from his notes. Most, Holmes conceded. Ashworth closed the velvet box. Outside, the fog had finally lifted. London was doing its occasional, slightly apologetic impression of a city with actual weather, thin winter sunlight finding its way between the buildings and laying itself along the pavement in pale, considerate strips. A motor car passed in the street below. Somewhere a church bell counted the hour, with the unhurried authority of something that has been counting hours in this city for several centuries, and intends to continue. Gerald Finch, Ashworth said. Holmes was quiet for a moment. He made a choice that the situation did not permit. Whether it was greed or desperation or something more complicated, I cannot say with certainty. He was careful and reliable for a long time, and then he wasn't. A pause. That is, unfortunately, a very human story. Ashworth nodded. He would think about Finch for a long time, about the dark coat still damp from the rain, about the extended arm on the prop vault floor, about the young man who had handed him the silver moustache every night for 2 seasons with perfect reliability, and apparently rather more knowledge than anyone had understood. He set the velvet box in his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said to both of them, because it belonged to both of them, Watson's careful steadiness as much as Holmes's precision, the harbour of calm at 221B as much as the cold logic of the prop vault corridor. Watson looked up from his notes with the warm, settled expression of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. "It was a pleasure, Mr. Ashworth. Do give our regards to Inspector Marlowe." Ashworth smiled, the first real, unguarded smile in 9 days, and stood and buttoned his coat. Holmes had already turned back to his desk, where something new was waiting, as something new always was. The violin case was open on the side table. The fire was conducting its steady business. The city outside was going about its ordinary oblivious day, full of its own small mysteries and unremarkable errands and the continuous, unhurried life of a place that has been many things to many people, and will be many more, before it is finished. Ashworth descended the stairs carefully, minding, as Mrs. Hudson had instructed on his first visit, the uneven 3rd step, and stepped out into the thin November sunlight. The case was closed. London received him back without comment, as it always does.